So the last tissue that we're going to look at here is going to be the nervous tissue. So just like with the other tissues, let's talk a little bit about the general characteristics. So neural neurons is the principal cell that we're going to see within the nervous tissue. Just like muscle, it's excitable, which means that it's going to change its structure and its function when the membrane potential changes. In this case here, what it's going to do is it's going to convey what's called an electrochemical message. It's going to transmit this depolarization, this change of membrane potential from point A to point B. It does this through a process within the cell known as the axon, which is basically an elongation of the cell body itself. The neurons themselves are specialized epithelial cells. They're actually specialized secretory epithelial cells, and in particular, they are columnar epithelial cells in derivation. They are connected to each other through specialized junctions of the gap style, through elongations and peripheral bifurcations of that axon in what's referred to as the synaptic terminal or axonal terminal. It's this single elongation of the cell body itself, this axon, that's going to carry the message away from the cell body towards its terminus. Once the neuron has become matured, it becomes amitotic, meaning that it will never undergo replication. This led to a misnomer that we don't have new neurons deriving throughout our body and we are constantly losing neurons. We are constantly losing neurons. However, we are still making neurons as we age. It's just that the rate at which neurons are being derived is much less than the rate at which the neurons are being lost. And so the total number of neurons do diminish. However, we still make neurons. The neurons that we make come from specialized neural cells known as stem cells. And the amount of stem cell derivation that we get is going to change based off of the stimuluses that we provide the neurons. We'll get much more detail into that when we talk about the nervous system itself. The neurons themselves are supported by specialized cells referred to as glial cells. These glial cells will act as immune cells and will act as other types of support cells within the nervous system. What is important to know is that the nervous system itself is surrounded by connective tissue that is highly impermeable and surrounded by epithelial cells that create a barrier that do not allow for distinct interactions with other systems and other cells of the body. And so the glial cells have to take on other types of roles that cells that we would see in other systems will take. And so if we look at the neuron itself, what we see is we see a centralized cell body known as the soma, surrounded by small outcrops known as the dendrites. We'll get more detail when we talk about the neurons within the nervous system discussions, with a long projection known as the axon. The axon is going to dictate the direction at which the message is derived, or is sent, and then it will synapse or junction onto other axons at the axonal terminals, which lead to the dendrites of the next axon in the sequence. And so if we look at the neuron itself in what's referred to as the neural smear, what we see is we see the cell body surrounded by a whole bunch of glial cells. And what you'll see is you'll see the short dendritic projections and then very long axonal projections. And so what we're seeing here is we're seeing a specialized form of neurons known as multipolar neurons. There are 5 distinct types of neurons that we have within the classification of neuron cells, and they're based off of the direction at which the axons are able to send signals, in which we have what's referred to as the unipolar cell. The unipolar cell will send directional signals in one direction only. We have the bipolar cell, which can send direction signals in 2 directions. We have the multipolar cell, which will be able to send and receive signals in multiple directions. There's a special classification of multipolar cells known as the pyramidal cells. and the Purkinje cells, which are involved with motor coordination. And then in the cerebral cortex, there's a specialized cell within the cortex known as the anaxonal or axonal neuron. These neurons, we can't actually delineate which is the dendrite and which is the axon. And what's really cool is that very recently, neuroscientists found that there's a specialized form of this anaxonal, which is referred to as the Rosetta neuron. And I'll show you an image of that when we actually discuss the tissues in lab. In terms of its structure, it's very elaborate in terms of its projections, and it actually forms kind of a rose shape of projections within the dendritic spines and within the axonal projections. Supporting the neurons are a whole bunch of support cells, which we call glias, and we classify these glias as neuroglia, astroglia, oligoglia, and then in the periphery, Schwann cells. In these glias, we have supporting glial cells, and then we have myelinating glial cells. Myelinating glial cells will produce a membrane around or a lamina around the axons that insulate the axons and allow for a faster neuron transmission of the action potential within the neuron. But what it also does is it also supports in the periphery the nerve itself to allow the neuron to traverse the length of the neuron and grow to where it's supposed to grow. The other ones that we see are the support glias, and those are going to act as macrophages and as fibroblasts within the central nervous system in particular, so as to support the neurons themselves in either their metabolic states or in their response to injury or inflammation. And so here we have a couple of examples, and we'll show some more when we look at the slides in lab of the various types of glial cells. And so notice that we have the myelinating cells. In this case here, we have the oligodendrocyte and the Schwann cell. The Schwann cell is found in the periphery, and the oligodendrocyte is found centrally. And we'll get more detail into how they actually function when we talk about the nervous system later on. And then we have the astroglias and the microglias. Astroglias are going to be in direct contact with the neurons themselves and are highly involved with metabolic processes of the neurons and will undergo metabolic shifts based off of nutrient loads for the body. Neurons are glucose obligated tissue. They are aerobic obligated tissue, meaning that they need a constant supply of glucose in order to function, and they have to have a constant rate of perfusion in order to allow for their metabolism to meet the demands of the tissue. What the astrocytes can do is they can take some of the other metabolites in circulation, things like ketones and pyruvate and lactate that are in circulation, and can convert them into things that the neuron itself can use in order to meet its metabolic demands. The microglia will act like macrophages and immune cells within the central nervous system and are highly involved with immunological responses and inflammatory responses to injury. And so we'll get a lot more detail about their functions and their role within the functional anatomy of the nervous system as we go through the nervous system lectures later this semester.